Infantilization is supposed to be harmless. It is framed as care, as protection, as guidance, but being treated like a child when you are not one is a form of control. The baby in yellow does not scare you with monsters. It scares you by slowly stripping away your autonomy and replacing it with obedience disguised as care. The horror is not the baby. The horror is what you are reduced to. The baby in yellow is not simply a game about babysitting gone wrong. It is a psychological horror game about forced infantilization. This analysis explores how the game turns care into coercion, responsibility into submission, and adulthood into something fragile and conditional. The fear is not that you fail to take care of the baby. The fear is that the game teaches you to stop acting like an adult at all. The baby in yellow places the player inside a space that feels ordinary, domestic, and controlled. There is no initial sense of danger. The apartment is quiet, the tasks are simple, the goal is clear: take care of the baby. This simplicity is deliberate. From the beginning, the player is assigned a role that implies responsibility, maturity, and authority. You are the caregiver. You are supposed to be in control. The game presents this position as stable and familiar. Nothing suggests that this role will be questioned. The tasks reinforce this illusion. Feed the baby. Change the diaper. Put the baby to sleep. These are routine actions associated with adulthood. The player performs them without resistance because they align with expectations. Care feels natural. But the structure of the game subtly undermines this authority. Every task is dictated. Instructions appear constantly. The player is not asked what to do, they are told. Even when actions feel intuitive, the game confirms them through explicit direction. This begins to shift the dynamic. The player is not making decisions. They are following orders. The environment reinforces obedience. Doors lock. Objects appear only when allowed. The apartment rearranges itself without explanation. The player adapts to these changes instinctively. They stop questioning the space and start responding to it. This is the first sign of regression. As the baby's behavior becomes increasingly abnormal, the player expects the game to escalate into overt threat. But instead of empowering the player, the game increases dependency. The more chaotic the situation becomes, the more the player relies on instructions. The baby never speaks. It does not negotiate. It does not reason. It exists as a silent authority. The player reacts to it, not the other way around. This reverses the expected power dynamic. The caregiver becomes reactive. The baby becomes central. The adult role begins to erode. The apartment itself behaves like a supervisory space. It watches, it responds, it corrects. When the player deviates, consequences appear quickly. When the player complies, the environment stabilizes. This feedback loop trains behavior. Importantly, the game does not frame this as punishment. It frames it as maintenance. When things go wrong, the solution is always more care, more obedience, more compliance. The player learns that resistance creates instability. Following instructions restores order. Over time, the player stops approaching tasks critically. They perform them automatically. The routine becomes mechanical. The player is no longer caring, they are complying. This is where infantilization begins to surface. The game reduces the player's agency incrementally. You cannot leave. You cannot refuse tasks. You cannot redefine your role. You exist within a narrow set of permitted actions. The player is treated less like an adult making decisions and more like a child completing chores. The tasks are simple. The expectations are rigid. Deviations are corrected immediately. The apartment becomes a controlled environment designed to enforce behavior. The baby becomes the justification for that control. The horror does not come from the baby's appearance. It comes from how completely the player accepts the system. By the time overt supernatural elements appear, the psychological shift has already occurred. The player is no longer questioning why they are doing these things. They are focused on doing them correctly. The baby in yellow establishes its horror by quietly reframing the player's role. You start as a caregiver, you end as a subordinate. The minimal context reveals the core mechanism of the game. Care is used as a narrative excuse to remove autonomy. Responsibility becomes obligation, obligation becomes submission, and submission is framed as safety. Players enter the baby in yellow, expecting a familiar horror structure. The setup suggests a clear power dynamic. You are the adult. The baby is dependent. The danger, if it appears, should threaten you from the outside. Something will go wrong, and you will respond. The game quietly dismantles this expectation. At first, the player assumes that strange behavior is temporary. The baby's unnatural movements, the distorted environment, and the sudden shifts in tone feel like preludes to escalation. The player waits for a moment where control must be reasserted. That moment never arrives. Instead of giving the player more authority, the game removes it. Each escalation introduces more instructions, not more choice. The player does not gain tools to confront the situation. They gain tasks to manage it. This breaks a core expectation of horror games. Progress does not equal empowerment. Understanding does not equal agency. The player also expects that disobedience will lead to narrative discovery. In many games, breaking rules reveals secrets. Here, deviation leads to immediate correction. The environment responds negatively. Stability is restored only through compliance. This conditions the player to stop experimenting. Another expectation collapses when the player realizes that fear does not come from threat. It comes from dependency. The more unstable the world becomes, the more the player clings to instructions. Obedience becomes a coping mechanism. The game reframes care as obligation. The baby's needs are endless. Feeding does not resolve hunger. Comfort does not create safety. The tasks repeat without closure. This breaks the expectation that care leads to resolution. The player begins to understand that no amount of effort will restore normalcy. The apartment reinforces this lesson. It behaves like a controlled system rather than a neutral space. Objects appear only when allowed, paths close without warning. The environment does not respond to logic. It responds to compliance. The player expects that confronting the baby will clarify the situation, but the baby remains silent, unresponsive. It never acknowledges authority. The lack of dialogue prevents negotiation. This breaks the expectation of mutual interaction. The baby does not recognize you as a caretaker. It treats you as a function. The game also breaks the expectation that adulthood guarantees control. The player performs adult responsibilities, but those responsibilities do not grant power. They create dependency. The more you care, the less control you have. This inversion is subtle but devastating. The player realizes that the role of caretaker has been weaponized. Care is no longer an expression of agency, it is a mechanism of restraint. The horror deepens when the player recognizes that they are not being tested. They are being trained. The game does not want to see what you will do. It wants to see how consistently you will obey. The expectation that horror escalates through danger is replaced by a realization. Horror escalates through normalization. By the time supernatural elements become explicit, the player has already accepted a diminished role. They no longer question why they are following instructions. They only focus on performing them correctly. The baby in yellow breaks the fantasy of adult control by showing how quickly authority dissolves under constant obligation. The player is not overpowered. They are reduced. This is the moment where forced infantilization becomes visible. The player's world shrinks. Options disappear. Autonomy fades. The expectation that adulthood protects against manipulation is shattered. And once that expectation breaks, the player understands that the real horror is not being attacked, it is being managed. Control rarely appears as domination at first. It appears as responsibility, as protection, as care. The baby in yellow builds its psychological horror on this validated mechanism. Power is not enforced by threat, it is enforced by obligation. From the beginning, the player is told they are responsible. The baby must be fed. The baby must be comforted. The baby must be kept safe. These demands feel morally justified. Refusing them feels wrong. This is how control embeds itself without resistance. Care becomes leverage. In many real-world systems, control is most effective when it disguises itself as concern. Parents, institutions, workplaces, and social systems often frame obedience as care for others. Follow the rules for their safety, comply for their well-being. Responsibility becomes a moral trap. The baby in yellow reflects this dynamic perfectly. The player is not threatened with punishment, they are threatened with failure. Failing to care feels unacceptable. The system never needs to coerce. It only needs to remind you of your duty. This transforms obedience into virtue. The game reinforces this through repetition. Tasks are simple but constant. Feed, clean, soothe. Each task reinforces the idea that your role exists solely to serve the baby's needs. There is no equivalent care offered to the player. Your well-being is irrelevant. This imbalance is crucial. Control through care requires asymmetry. One side is allowed to demand endlessly. The other is expected to respond endlessly. Over time, the player internalizes this imbalance. They stop questioning whether tasks are reasonable. They focus on fulfilling them correctly. Efficiency replaces reflection. The apartment behaves like an authority that never raises its voice. It simply enforces boundaries. Doors lock, spaces restrict movement, objects appear only when permitted. These controls are not explained, they are normalized. This mirrors how caring systems operate in reality. Rules are justified by safety. Boundaries are justified by protection. Over time, these justifications stop being questioned. The baby itself functions as an unquestionable authority. It does not argue. It does not explain. It exists as a constant demand. Its silence is powerful. The player cannot negotiate with it. They can only comply. This silence removes moral complexity. The baby cannot justify itself. It does not need to. The system assumes its legitimacy. The player begins to experience anxiety not from danger, but from anticipation. What task comes next? What demand must be met? Fear becomes procedural. This is where control tightens. When fear is procedural, resistance feels impractical. The safest response is compliance. The baby in yellow shows how care can strip autonomy without ever appearing abusive. The player is not mistreated. They are over-obligated. Their identity collapses into function. This is forced infantilization. The player is treated as incapable of autonomy. Decisions are made for them. Instructions replace choice. The world assumes they cannot be trusted to act independently. Ironically, this infantilization is justified by care. The system treats the player like a child while demanding adult responsibility. This contradiction is psychologically damaging. It creates dependence without support. The player is expected to obey, but not to understand. This mirrors real situations where individuals are burdened with responsibility but denied authority. Control through care thrives in this contradiction. By the time the player recognizes that their role has been reduced, the system is already complete. They no longer act as an adult caretaker, they act as a compliant subordinate. The baby in yellow validates a disturbing truth. Control does not need cruelty, it needs justification. And care is one of the most convincing justifications there is. Regression is often misunderstood as weakness. In psychology, regression is a response to pressure. When autonomy becomes dangerous or unsupported, the mind retreats to simpler behavioral states. The baby in yellow constructs a system that quietly pushes the player into this regression without ever announcing it. From the outside, the player appears to be performing adult tasks, feeding, cleaning, managing responsibility. But internally, the role shifts. The player is no longer deciding. They are reacting. Their behavior becomes stimulus-based rather than intentional. This is the core of forced regression. The game removes complexity from the player's actions. Tasks are broken into simple steps. Instructions are explicit. Feedback is immediate. This structure mirrors how children are guided. Do this, now do that. Correct behavior is rewarded with stability. The player is not trusted to interpret the situation. They are trusted only to follow directions. As the environment becomes more hostile, the player expects to rely on problem solving. Instead, the game restricts that option. There are no strategic decisions to make. There is no meaningful planning. The safest response is always obedience. This trains dependency. The player begins to wait for instructions rather than initiate action. Moments of uncertainty are resolved by checking objectives. This behavioral shift is subtle but powerful. Initiative disappears. Regression also appears emotionally. The player's anxiety becomes anticipatory rather than reflective. They worry about doing things wrong rather than understanding what is happening. Fear becomes tied to approval. The baby's presence reinforces this dynamic. It functions as a focal point for authority without explanation. The baby does not react logically, it reacts absolutely. This removes negotiation and reinforces obedience. In real psychological regression, individuals often return to behaviors associated with safety. Familiar routines, external guidance, reduced responsibility for decision-making. The baby in yellow simulates this by creating a world where autonomy leads to chaos and obedience leads to order. The player learns that questioning makes things worse. Compliance stabilizes the environment. This creates a powerful incentive to regress. Over time, the player's sense of adulthood erodes. Being an adult normally involves judgment, boundary setting, and refusal. None of these are available. The game removes the tools of adulthood while maintaining the burden of responsibility. This contradiction creates helplessness. Helplessness is a precursor to regression. When action does not produce change, the mind stops trying. The player does not feel empowered to resist. They feel compelled to endure. The game never tells the player they are powerless. It simply structures the world so that power is meaningless. This makes regression feel natural rather than forced. The most disturbing aspect of this regression is that it feels safe. The player is not harmed for obeying. They are protected from escalation. Stability returns when instructions are followed. This mirrors real situations where individuals regress emotionally to survive controlling environments. The behavior is adaptive, not irrational. The baby in yellow frames regression as functional. It works. It keeps things manageable. That is why it is dangerous. The player is not stripped of agency violently. They surrender it gradually. Each act of compliance reinforces the next. Autonomy fades not through force, but through repetition. By the time the player recognizes this shift, the role reversal is complete. The caretaker behaves like a child. The baby behaves like an authority. Forced regression is the hidden engine of the game's horror. It explains why the experience feels suffocating rather than shocking. The player is not being attacked. They are being reduced. This is where the baby in yellow fully reveals what it has been doing from the beginning. Forced infantilization and control are not separate mechanisms. They depend on each other. Control creates regression. Regression makes control sustainable. The game does not remove the player's power directly. It reframes power as dangerous. Every moment of autonomy introduces instability. Every attempt to act independently escalates the situation. The world teaches the player a simple rule: safety comes from obedience. This is how infantilization works psychologically. Adults are not treated as children by being mocked or belittled. They are treated as children by being denied authority while still being burdened with responsibility. The baby in yellow enforces this contradiction relentlessly. The player is responsible for everything, yet allowed to decide nothing. Tasks must be completed, but methods are dictated. The environment constantly intervenes. This erodes the player's sense of agency until obedience feels like the only rational response. As infantilization deepens, control becomes internal. The player no longer needs to be instructed constantly. They anticipate expectations. They adjust behavior preemptively. They avoid actions that might destabilize the environment. This is the most effective stage of control. The system no longer needs to enforce rules. The player enforces them on themselves. The compound effect is devastating. Infantilization reduces confidence in independent judgment. Control exploits that doubt. The more the player doubts themselves, the more they rely on external instruction. The more they rely on instruction, the less capable they feel of acting alone. The game never explicitly states that the player is incapable. It allows them to feel incapable. This mirrors real-world dynamics of coercive care. Institutions, relationships, and systems often justify control by framing individuals as incapable of self-management. Guidance becomes supervision. Supervision becomes restriction. Restriction becomes normal. The player realizes that the baby does not need to dominate them actively. The system has already done the work. The baby exists as a symbol of endless demand. The environment exists as enforcement. The player exists as compliance. What makes this horror so uncomfortable is that it feels earned. The player believes they adapted intelligently. They believe obedience was the safest option. The system never feels arbitrary. It feels reasonable. This is the final trap. Once control feels reasonable, resistance feels irresponsible. The player stops asking whether they should obey and starts asking whether they are obeying correctly. Infantilization completes itself here. The player's identity collapses into performance. Success is defined by approval. Failure is defined by disruption. There is no space for autonomy. The horror is not that the player becomes weak. It is that weakness is framed as maturity. Endurance replaces agency. Compliance replaces judgment. The baby in yellow shows how easily adulthood can be stripped away without force. All it takes is responsibility without authority and care without consent. By the time the player recognizes this pattern, the experience has already reshaped how they think. The game has trained them to accept control as protection and regression as safety. This is why the horror lingers. It does not end when the game ends. The player recognizes the pattern elsewhere, situations where care feels conditional, where obedience is rewarded, where autonomy feels risky. The compound theme exposes a truth that is difficult to confront. Infantilization is not about being treated like a child. It is about being prevented from acting like an adult. And control thrives wherever that prevention is justified by care. The baby in yellow does not conclude with escape or victory. It ends with recognition. By the time the experience is over, the player understands that nothing truly needed to overpower them. The system worked because it never challenged them directly. It simply reframed obedience as care and regression as safety. This is what makes the ending so unsettling. The player realizes that at no point were they treated with overt cruelty. They were given tasks, instructions, responsibilities. Everything looked reasonable, necessary, even benevolent. And yet, something essential was taken away. Adulthood, not in the sense of age or role, but in the sense of agency, the ability to say no, to set boundaries, to decide what is acceptable. The game never needed to threaten the player to remove these things. It only needed to keep them busy. By the end, the player recognizes that their compliance was not extracted through fear of harm, but fear of failure, fear of neglect, fear of being responsible for something going wrong. Care became a moral weapon. This recognition lingers because it feels familiar. Many systems operate the same way. They do not demand submission openly. They demand responsibility. They frame obedience as maturity. They present control as protection. And over time, autonomy is treated as recklessness. The player is left sitting with an uncomfortable realization. Infantilization does not always come from being treated as incapable. Sometimes it comes from being treated as responsible for everything, but trusted with nothing. The baby in yellow shows that regression does not feel like collapse. It feels like relief. When autonomy disappears, so does the burden of decision-making. Obedience simplifies the world. Instructions replace uncertainty. That simplicity is seductive. The horror is not that the player was manipulated. It is that the manipulation felt reasonable, logical, even comforting. The system never lied. It simply framed compliance as care. The game does not ask the player to feel guilty. It asks them to notice. Notice how quickly authority shifted. Notice how easily adulthood dissolved. Notice how obedience began to feel safer than autonomy. The experience ends without resolving these questions because forced infantilization rarely resolves cleanly. It persists as habit, as expectation, as internalized behavior. By the time the player steps away, the baby is no longer the focus. The system is. The apartment, the instructions, the routines, the constant correction, the sense that deviating would make things worse. The final discomfort comes from recognizing that the horror did not depend on supernatural elements at all. Those were decoration. The true mechanism was psychological: care without consent, responsibility without authority, safety without autonomy. These conditions exist far beyond the game. At some point, the player must ask themselves where else they have accepted regression in exchange for stability, where else obedience has been framed as maturity, where else care has quietly removed choice. If this kind of analysis resonates with you, if you are interested in horror that examines how power, care, and control shape human behavior, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, horror is not about what threatens us directly, but about what quietly decides who we are allowed to be.